But even if Bharat manages to stabilize the rupee, the economic pain from the oil shock is still going to spread across multiple industries. Because oil is not just fuel, oil is the foundation for almost every major economic activity in a modern economy. Which means when crude prices surge, the shock spreads everywhere. The aviation industry is among the first sectors to get hit. Because fuel is one of the largest operating costs for airlines, as aviation turbine fuel price increase, airlines either absorb losses or pass the cost directly to passengers through higher ticket prices. This is exactly the reason why domestic and international travel costs began rising sharply during the 2026 oil shock. The logistics and transport sector also faces immediate pressure. Bharat's economy runs heavily on road transport. Most goods across the country move through the diesel-powered trucks. So when diesel prices rise, the cost of moving food, raw materials and consumer goods and industrial products rises almost immediately. And eventually, these costs get passed on to ordinary consumers. This is called an inflationary pass-through. Inflationary pass-through simply means rising input costs eventually spread through the broader economy. And oil has one of the strongest pass-through effects because transportation impacts almost everything. Chemical industries are also highly vulnerable because petrochemicals are used in plastics, fertilizers, paints, synthetic materials, and industrial manufacturing. As crude prices rise, raw material costs increase sharply. Margins begin collapsing. The same applies to tire manufacturers, paint companies, footwear producers, and even cement manufacturers. Because cement production itself is highly energy intensive. Then comes agriculture. Higher diesel prices increases irrigation and transport costs. And fertilizer prices also rise because many fertilizers are linked directly to natural gas and petroleum products. That eventually feeds into food inflation. Cooking gas prices also become vulnerable. India imports roughly 60% of its LPG requirements, which means that household cooking costs are directly exposed to global energy volatility. And perhaps the most politically sensitive impact of all, retail fuel prices. Petrol and diesel prices directly affect the psychology of inflation in India. Because once fuel prices start rising visibly, people begin expecting everything else to become expensive too. And that expectation itself can become inflationary. Which is exactly why the government reduced fuel excise duties despite worsening fiscal stress. Because policymakers understood that uncontrolled fuel inflation could damage both household finances and public confidence simultaneously. And this is the difficult reality Bharat now faces. The country is trying to defend its currency, its reserves, its financial stability, and its consumers, all during one of the most volatile geopolitical energy environments in recent years. This is where austerity enters the picture. Now, when people hear the word austerity, they usually imagine brutal tax hikes and collapsing public spending. But Bharat's current response is more nuanced than that. What Bharat is implementing right now is primarily spending-based stabilization, not aggressive tax-based austerity. And understanding that distinction is extremely important. Spending-based austerity focuses on reducing expenditure, preserving foreign exchange, and slowing resource leakage. Tax-based austerity focuses mainly on increasing taxes to reduce deficits. Historically, economists generally consider spending-based adjustment less economically destructive. And Bharat's current measures reflect that logic. Prime Minister Narendra Modi publicly urged citizens to conserve fuel, reduce unnecessary foreign exchange spending, and avoid non-excessive, non-essential imports, including gold. At the same time, government expenditure growth contracted sharply. But here's where the situation becomes more complicated. Even while urging austerity, the government also reduced excise duties on fuel to soften the inflation shock on ordinary citizens. That decision created a trade off. Because excise duties on petrol and diesel are one of the government's major revenue sources. Historically, Bharat has often maintained high fuel excise duties even when global crude prices softened. Critics argued consumers were absorbing the burden, but in 2026, the government temporarily moved in the opposite direction. It reduced fuel duties to prevent inflation from spiraling completely out of control. That helped consumers somewhat in the short term. But it also reduced government revenue during a period of already rising fiscal stress, which shows how difficult this balancing act really is. Meanwhile, the RBI intervened aggressively in currency markets, selling over $50.8 billion to slow the rupee's decline. Banks were also ordered to cap speculative foreign exchange exposure because the government's immediate priority became very clear: prevent panic, stabilize the currency, and buy time before the crisis spreads deeper into the economy. But here's the controversial question: do austerity measures actually work? Economists have fought over this for decades. One side argues austerity stabilizes economies, the other argues it destroys them. Pro-austerity economists like Alberto Alessina argued that large spending cuts can actually restore investor confidence and trigger growth. This became known as the expansionary fiscal contraction. The idea sounds counterintuitive, but the logic is simple. If markets believe a country is regaining control of debt, investors may return. Borrowing costs may stabilize and private investment may even recover. Countries like Canada in the 1990s, Denmark in the 1980s, Ireland, Belgium, and Sweden are often cited as examples where spending based austerity was followed by economic recovery. Canada especially became a famous case. Massive expenditure reductions helped stabilize debt, restore confidence, and eventually support long term growth. But critics strongly disagree. Economists like Paul Krugman argued austerity often becomes self defeating because spending cuts reduce economic activity, which slows growth, which can actually worsen debt burdens. This debate often exploded after Greece, where severe austerity caused deep recession, mass unemployment, and social collapse. Critics also point to something called the fiscal multiplier. A fiscal multiplier measures how strongly government spending affects economic activity. And in Bharat's case, infrastructure spending has historically carried a very high multiplier effect, meaning every rupee of public investment can generate multiple rupees of downstream economic activity across manufacturing, logistics, employment, construction, and private investment, which also means spending cuts can damage growth far more than policymakers initially expect. And that's why austerity remains one of the most controversial economic strategies in the world. So, after looking at all of this, the real question becomes: why would Bharat even consider austerity during a crisis like this? Wouldn't cutting spending during an economic slowdown make things even worse? And under normal conditions, that criticism would absolutely make sense. But Bharat's current problem is not a traditional recession driven by weak domestic demand. It's an external shock crisis, a geopolitical oil shock colliding with currency pressure, capital flight, and rising import costs. And that changes the equation completely. Because right now, Bharat is not just trying to accelerate growth, it's trying to prevent instability. And those two are very different objectives. That is why understanding the type of austerity Bharat is moving toward becomes extremely important. And as we already know, austerity takes two forms: tax based or spending based. Historically, tax based austerity can often produce severe economic slowdowns. Because during periods of stress, higher taxes can crush private consumption and investment simultaneously. This is exactly why countries like Greece, Spain, and Portugal struggled so badly after 2010. Large tax hikes combined with spending cuts pushed their economies into deep recessions. And in Greece, this caused a doom loop. Government debt weakened banks, weak banks weakened the economy, and the economy further weakened government finances. It became a vicious spiral. That is precisely the scenario Indian policymakers are trying to avoid. And that is exactly why Bharat's current response is leaning far more towards spending based stabilization rather than aggressive tax based austerity. The government has not launched massive economy wide tax hikes. Instead, it is focusing on reducing expenditure growth, controlling foreign exchange leakage, and slowing non essential dollar outflows. Now, here's the critical point. Supporters of austerity argue that in situations of severe external stress, the priority is not maximizing short term growth. The priority instead is restoring stability. But if markets lose confidence in the rupee, the consequences become larger than slower GDP growth. Imports become dramatically more expensive, inflation accelerates, foreign investors panic further, bond yields rise, banks face stress, and eventually the financial system itself comes under pressure. This is exactly why economists who support spending based austerity often point to countries like Canada during the 1990s. Canada faced serious debt concerns and fiscal instability. The government aggressively reduced expenditure, stabilized deficits, and restored market confidence. That is, eventually. Investment returned and growth recovered. And this is the key argument Bharat's policymakers are now indirectly following. Stabilization first, growth recovery later. Because if the macroeconomic foundation collapses, long term growth becomes impossible anyway. But critics strongly disagree with this approach. Critics argue that when governments cut spending during economic stress, they reduce demand inside the economy. Consumers spend less, business invests less, hiring slows, and economic activity weakens further. Critics also argue and warn about inequality because austerity often hurts middle income and lower income households the hardest. Public spending slows, inflation remains elevated, and ordinary citizens absorb the pressure. So, this debate is not black and white. Austerity is not automatically good and it is not automatically bad. Its success depends heavily on timing, debt levels, and whether the crisis is internal or external. In Bharat's situation, it is very unique. This is not simply a domestic policy failure. Bharat is facing an imported oil shock, a global dollar squeeze, geopolitical instability, capital outflows, and rising energy dependency simultaneously. Which means policymakers are trying to prevent panic even before panic becomes systemic. And that explains why Bharat's current approach looks more like controlled stabilization rather than extreme austerity. Because the government is essentially trying to buy time. Time for oil prices to stabilize, time for markets to calm down, time for the rupee to stop collapsing, and time for the broader financial system to absorb the shock without entering a full-scale doom loop. The battlefield of the modern conflict is no longer limited to borders. Sometimes it begins in shipping lanes, in central banks, in currency markets, in oil cartels, and inside the psychology of investors. Bharat's current crisis is not simply about expensive fuel. It is about what happens when a rising power remains deeply dependent on external energy systems during a period of global fragmentation. And that is why austerity measures are now being framed not merely as economic policy, but as economic defense. Because when oil prices surge, currencies weaken, and capital flees, governments eventually face one brutal question: how do you stabilize a nation before panic becomes systemic? For Bharat, the answer may begin with restraint. Not because austerity is painless, but because in moments of external shock, survival itself becomes strategy. And in the modern world, economic stability may just be as important as military strength.